He built an empire on silence and fear. Every deal, every betrayal buried beneath his control. But one call tore through the armor he'd spent a lifetime forging. She's in critical condition, and she keeps saying your name. The woman Lucian Dravaro left to keep safe was fighting for her life and carrying something that could destroy him. Now, as he storms through the hospital doors, drenched in rain and rage, the truth waiting on the other side isn't just about love or loss. It's about the one secret powerful enough to end the man who ruled the city. The story doesn't end here. Subscribe to Mafia Soul now to see what happened next, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Every view keeps these stories alive. The clock on Lucian Dravaro's desk glowed 22:41 when his phone began to vibrate against the polished obsidian surface. He didn't recognize the number, and in his world, unknown numbers after midnight rarely brought anything but ghosts. He almost ignored it. His thumb hovered over decline while the rain hammered the glass walls of his penthouse, the city lights flickering far below like dying embers. But something, instinct, fate, or maybe guilt, made him answer. Mr. Dravaro. The voice was female, professional, but cracking beneath urgency. This is Dr. Morgan from St. Victoria's Hospital. I'm calling about a patient, Selena Clinton. Lucian's entire body went rigid. The half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand felt suddenly heavier, as if the past itself had reached out and chained him to the floor. Selena. The name hit like a blade drawn slowly across old scars. The woman he'd left months ago to keep safe from the blood and chaos of his empire. The one mistake he never stopped regretting. What happened? His voice came out sharper than intended. Low, dangerous, each syllable a command forged in habit and fear. She was admitted in critical condition, the doctor replied. Lucian could hear the muffled roar of chaos in the background. Monitors beeping, nurses shouting orders, the metallic scrape of gurney wheels. She went into premature labor. Severe complications. She keeps asking for you, sir. You're listed as her family contact. For a moment, the Don of the Dravaro syndicate stopped breathing. Premature labor. Family contact. Her voice calling his name. The phone nearly slipped from his hand. The amber liquid spilled across the desk, running in dark rivulets over the documents of men who had once feared him. Now, fear belonged to him. Lucian rose so fast his chair toppled backward, skidding across the marble. Across the room, Enzo Calder, his second-in-command, straightened immediately, sensing something far worse than a business call. Boss! Lucian's coat was already in his hand. His eyes, the cold steel that ruled New York's underworld, burned with something no one in that room had ever seen before. Get the car. Now. He didn't explain, didn't wait for questions. Within seconds, Enzo and two men were in motion. The black convoy roared through the storm-drenched streets, tires slicing through puddles as thunder cracked overhead. In the back seat, Lucian sat forward, elbows on his knees, phone pressed to his ear. Dr. Morgan, listen to me carefully. Yes, Mr. Dravaro. You keep her alive. I don't care what it costs. Money favors gold. Call in every surgeon in that damn city if you have to drag them out of their beds. You save her and that child. Do you understand? Yes, sir. We're doing everything we can. The line buzzed with static and distant sirens. Lucian ended the call and exhaled slowly, hands trembling for the first time in years. The city outside blurred past, neon bleeding into rain. He remembered the night he walked away from Selena, telling her she deserved a world untouched by blood and power. He told himself it was mercy. But mercy looked a lot like cowardice when you were driving through a storm praying she wasn't gone. The ER doors slammed open under the weight of his entrance. Men in black suits followed, forming a silent wall behind him. Inside, the chaos swallowed him whole. Nurses rushing, machines wailing, the air thick with antiseptic and fear. Dr. Morgan met him halfway down the corridor. Her scrubs were streaked with crimson. Her gloves trembled. She's in surgery. The baby's in distress. We're trying to stabilize her blood pressure. Then stop talking and fix it." Lucian's tone dropped to a lethal whisper that carried farther than any shout. "If she dies, none of you will walk out of this building. If she lives, I'll build you a new hospital." Dr. Morgan swallowed hard and nodded. "Understood." Through the small circular window of the operating room, he caught a glimpse. Selina's face pale under the harsh lights, tubes and wires weaving across her fragile frame. She looked nothing like the woman who used to tease him for his obsession with control. She looked like a memory he might lose forever. He pressed a hand against the cold glass. Outside, lightning flashed, illuminating the tattoos on his wrist, the bloodline of violence that had defined him. "You're not leaving me again," he whispered. "Not like this." The night he left her, the city was quiet, too quiet for New York. The skyline burned in the distance, gold bleeding into black. But inside the penthouse, it was silent enough to hear a heart break. Selina stood by the window in one of his shirts, bare feet brushing against the cold marble. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper. "You're not even looking at me." Lucian didn't turn. He sat on the edge of his desk, sleeves rolled up, cigarette burning low between his fingers. Every drag bought him another second before he had to destroy the only good thing left in his life. "Lucian," she said again, coming closer. "If something's wrong, talk to me. Don't shut me out." He exhaled smoke and swallowed hard. She would never understand. She wasn't supposed to. He had enemies, men who'd burn the world to hurt him, who'd watched him fall in love and waited for a weakness. And she was it. "You don't understand what you're asking," he muttered. "I'm asking you not to disappear," she whispered. He looked at her then, really looked. The kind of look that carved itself into memory. There were 1,000 things he could have said. Instead, he lied. "You were a mistake, Selina." Her breath caught. "Don't do this." "You wanted the truth." "That's it." He crushed the cigarette in the ashtray and stood. "You were never supposed to be part of my world." Her tears came fast. "You don't mean that." "I do." And that was it. The lie he'd carry for the rest of his life. He walked past her, past the scent of her perfume lingering in the air, past the picture of them that she'd left on his nightstand. Every step felt like losing oxygen. When he reached the elevator, Enzo was waiting. The right-hand man saw the look on his boss's face and didn't ask. But after a long moment, he said quietly, "You sure this is the way?" Lucian's eyes stayed fixed on the city lights. "It's the only way she lives." The elevator doors closed, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel powerful. He felt empty. Weeks passed. He buried himself in business, in silence, in the illusion of control. But she stayed with him. Her laughter, her warmth, the way she used to trace the tattoos on his hands and tell him he wasn't the monster he thought he was. He told himself forgetting her was protection. It wasn't. It was punishment. Selina found out she was pregnant 2 months after he left. The morning sun had barely touched her apartment when she saw the test turn positive. She stared at it, shaking, tears slipping down her face as 100 memories crashed through her chest. "Lucian," she whispered. She almost called him. Her hand hovered over the phone for an eternity before she set it down. He'd left to protect her. Dragging him back into her life would only paint a target on both of them. So she made a choice. She packed her things, left the apartment, disappeared into the quieter corners of the city. Changed jobs. Changed her name. Started working at St. Victoria's Hospital. She told no one who the father was. When people asked, she smiled and said, "He's gone." But at night, when the city lights flickered through the blinds, she'd whisper to the small life growing inside her. "He's not a bad man," she'd tell the baby. "He's just lost." Lucian, meanwhile, haunted his own world like a ghost. Every deal, every late-night meeting, every toast of whiskey felt like a cover for something hollow. He'd stare at his reflection and see her face in it. Sometimes he'd reach for the phone. Sometimes he'd even dial her number, then hang up before the first ring. When the months passed and he didn't hear from her, he convinced himself she'd moved on. Maybe that was mercy. Maybe it was what she deserved. 8 months later, the storm came. Selena was at work when the pain started. Sharp, unrelenting. The contractions came fast, too fast. Her co-workers rushed her into a delivery room, panic spreading through the halls. Between gasps of breath, she caught the doctor's arm. If something happens, her voice cracked. Call Lucian Dravaro. He's family. The doctor froze at the name. Everyone in the city knew it, the kind of name whispered like a warning. But she nodded, scribbling it down. And as the machines beeped and voices blurred around her, Selena's lips kept moving. Lucian, Lucian, Lucian. Somewhere miles away, in a penthouse wrapped in glass and shadows, that same name burned in his ears when the phone rang. Now he understood why she'd never called. Now he knew what secret she'd been carrying all along. And for the first time in his life, Lucian Dravaro prayed. Not for forgiveness, not for power, but for a second chance he didn't deserve. The storm outside hadn't eased. It only grew meaner. A black sky split by lightning that turned the hospital windows white every few seconds. Inside, the air was thicker than the rain, filled with the hum of machines, the rush of nurses, and the low, steady breathing of a man trying not to lose the last thing that mattered to him. Lucian Dravaro stood just outside the operating room, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on the small glass window. Beyond it, Selena lay still under harsh lights, her body surrounded by strangers in masks and gloves, their movements urgent, controlled chaos in motion. The sight of blood didn't shake him. It never had. But this blood, her blood, it did something he wasn't built for. Enzo hovered a few feet away. Phone pressed to his ear, voice low. Yeah, lock down the south entrance. Nobody gets in without clearance. Not police, not press, not even priests. He ended the call and turned back to Lucian. Word's getting out, boss. Some nurse took a picture. The tabloids are sniffing around already. Lucian's jaw tightened. Handle it. I'm trying, Enzo said. But there's more. Verno's men were seen near the Queen's Tunnel an hour ago. Could be nothing. Could be they heard. Lucian didn't answer. His focus stayed on the flicker of light over Selena's body, the rhythmic movement of doctors' hands. One of them shouted for more blood. Another barked numbers that meant nothing to him, except that she was slipping away. He closed his eyes for half a second. The sound of the machines became something else. The memory of gunfire, of screams in alleyways, of every soul he'd buried under his name. And somewhere under it all, her voice, months ago, begging him to stay. He opened his eyes and said quietly, if Verno steps within 5 miles of this building, burn everything he owns. Enzo nodded, already moving, giving orders to men positioned in black SUVs around the hospital perimeter. Within minutes, the parking lot became a fortress, tinted windows, silent radios, men with eyes sharper than knives. Inside, the doctor's voice rose. She's crashing. Lucian stepped closer to the glass. He could see them working on her, the flicker of a defibrillator, the desperate rhythm of pressure on her chest. His reflection overlapped hers in the glass, the killer and the woman he'd killed himself to protect. He wasn't built for prayer, but something like it broke through anyway. A whisper caught between teeth. You're not dying on me. Not like this. The heart monitor wailed, then steadied again. A faint beep, fragile but alive. The doctor exhaled and gave a signal. She's stabilizing. The baby's almost there. Lucian didn't move. Couldn't. The storm outside pounded against the glass like the world itself was demanding something from him. He had nothing left to give except this, his rage, his money, his men. Whatever it took to keep her breathing. Enzo returned, breath fogging in the cold hallway. Everything's sealed. About 4 men at each entrance and 2 in the staff elevators. Nobody gets through without my voice on the line. Lucian nodded once, still watching the window. Good. Boss. Enzo hesitated. You should know. The press already has your name linked to her. It's spreading fast. They're saying the Don's ex-lover is dying in childbirth. Lucian's expression didn't change, but his silence said enough. She wrote you down as family, Lucian, Enzo said softly. She never stopped trusting you. That landed harder than any bullet. Family. The word he'd spent his life twisting into something unrecognizable. In the corner, a nurse hurried past carrying a blood bag marked Clinton, Selena. He watched it disappear behind the surgery doors and felt something break loose inside him. Every second of that operation felt like a countdown, not for her life, but for his redemption. Outside, the rain slowed, but the storm inside didn't. His men called in updates. A journalist detained, a Verno scout spotted and silenced near the back alley. Enzo handled it all quietly, efficiently, like a man who'd cleaned up this kind of chaos before. And still, Lucian didn't move. The clock on the wall crept past 2 a.m. The hallway was nearly empty now, just him, Enzo, and the soft hum of machines. The door to the operating room finally opened, a nurse stepping out with eyes rimmed red behind her mask. Lucian turned sharply. Talk. She's alive, the nurse said. But we're not done yet. The baby's struggling. We need more time. He nodded, jaw locked. Then take it. She disappeared back through the door. The world felt smaller now, the air heavier, the storm quieter but closer somehow. Enzo stood beside him, hands in his pockets, eyes flicking toward the window. You know, Enzo said quietly, most people would pray right now. Lucian gave a faint, humorless smile. God stopped listening to me a long time ago. Another flash of lightning painted the corridor white. Lucian stared through the glass again. The doctors moved fast, their shadows dancing against the walls. Somewhere in that blur of motion was his entire world, the woman he loved and the child he never knew existed. Outside, the city buzzed with whispers. Inside, time stood still. The silent war had begun, not with guns or blood, but with a heartbeat fighting to survive and a man who would burn everything he'd built just to hear it keep beating. The storm had finally broken into a whisper. The rain slowed, the thunder retreated into the distance, and yet inside St. Victoria's, everything still trembled. The lights in the operating room flickered once, the faint hum of the heart monitor filling the corridor like the rhythm of a dying clock. Lucian hadn't moved in hours. His coat was draped over a chair, his shirt sleeves rolled up, the veins on his hands visible against skin that looked carved from stone. The hallway around him had emptied. Even the nurses spoke in hushed tones when they passed. Through the window, he could still see her, Selena, motionless beneath the white glare, her body barely recognizable beneath the web of tubes and wires. A nurse adjusted a monitor. Another whispered something to the doctor. None of it made sense to him, only the sound, the beeping, the soft rush of machines doing what his power, his men, and his money could not. Behind him, Enzo appeared quietly, phone in hand. Verno's gone silent, he said. Our people swept the hospital. Nobody got close. It's secure. Lucian didn't answer. His eyes stayed on the woman who had once smiled at him like he was worth saving. She's still fighting? Enzo asked, voice low. Lucian nodded once. They said she would. She always does. For a moment, Enzo hesitated before adding, You should sit. You look like hell. Lucian almost smiled, almost. Hell's the only place I ever belonged. He turned back to the glass, and for a second, the noise inside the room shifted, the sharp cry of a doctor, a sudden flurry of movement. Then the sound came, a small, piercing cry that sliced through the silence like sunlight through fog. Lucian froze. He didn't breathe, didn't blink. He'd heard the cries of dying men, of enemies begging for mercy, of storms tearing roofs off buildings, but never this. A baby's cry. The doctor's voice carried faintly through the door. He's breathing. We've got him. Lucian's throat tightened. His hand pressed against the glass as if he could feel it. Life, fragile and new, the sound that meant Selena had held on long enough to bring something pure into a world that didn't deserve it. The door opened and Dr. Morgan stepped out, her eyes tired but bright. "Mr. Dravaro," she said, "the baby's stable. A boy." Lucian's voice was barely a whisper. "And her?" The doctor hesitated, the joy draining from her face. "She lost a lot of blood. We're still working to stabilize her. The next few hours will decide everything." He nodded slowly, jaw clenched tight. "Let me see him." The doctor hesitated only a moment before leading him to the neonatal ward. Behind a clear incubator lay a tiny bundle, red-faced and small enough to fit in one of his hands. A nurse adjusted the blanket, and Lucian just stood there, motionless, staring down at this impossible thing that carried his name and her strength. He whispered it under his breath, testing the sound. "Nicola." The baby stirred, a faint whimper escaping his lips. Lucian's chest tightened, something breaking loose inside him. He'd built empires, ordered deaths, rewritten laws with fear, but nothing had ever felt like this. Nothing had ever made him feel so small. He reached out and placed his hand on the incubator's glass. His reflection wavered beside the baby's tiny form. Two Dravaros, one made of sins, the other untouched by them. He spoke quietly, the words coming rough and slow. "You'll never know this world the way I did. Not the blood, not the fear. I swear it." Behind him, Enzo lingered in the doorway. He didn't interrupt. The boss's voice had changed. It wasn't the one that commanded soldiers or silenced rivals. It was human, raw. Lucian stayed like that for a long while, hand pressed to the glass, until the nurse's voice broke the moment. "She's stable. You can see her now." He followed silently, each step heavier than the last. Inside the recovery room, Selina looked pale, drained but alive. Her breathing was shallow, but steady. Machines hummed softly beside her bed. Lucian sat down, his body sinking into the chair like the weight of every choice he'd ever made had finally found a place to rest. He reached for her hand. It was cold, fragile, but real. "I made a lot of promises in my life," he murmured, voice low enough that only she could hear. "Most of them I broke. But this one I'll keep." He leaned closer, thumb brushing the back of her hand. "You gave me a son. You gave me something I didn't even know I wanted. From now on, everything I am, every deal, every breath, every drop of blood, is for you and him." The machines beeped softly in response, like a vow sealed by the sound of her heart still beating. Outside, dawn began to break over the city, washing the skyline in muted gold. The world was the same, but he wasn't. For the first time in his life, Lucian Dravaro didn't feel like a king or a monster. He just felt like a man who'd been given a second chance, and he intended to protect it with everything he had. Morning bled slowly into the city, pale and unforgiving. The world outside St. Victoria's moved on. Cars, headlines, men going to work. But inside the hospital, time stayed still. Lucian Dravaro stood by the window of Selina's recovery room, watching the light creep across the floor. It painted her face gold, almost peaceful, and for a few precious minutes he believed the storm was over. He was wrong. Enzo entered quietly, closing the door behind him. The look on his face told Lucian before he spoke. "Trouble. Talk," Lucian said without turning. Enzo's voice was steady, but the tension beneath it was sharp. "Someone's been leaking. The wrong people know she's here. Verno's crew picked up chatter about a woman and child connected to you. They're sniffing around the hospital." Lucian's jaw tightened. He didn't need to ask how Verno found out. Betrayal always came from inside. "Who?" Enzo hesitated. "Adrian Vale." Lucian turned, the name cutting through the air like a blade. Adrian, his lieutenant, the man who'd shared a cell with him 15 years ago, the one he'd pulled from the gutter and made family. "You sure?" Enzo nodded. "He met with Verno's man in Brooklyn last night. I've got the photos, the call logs. He's the leak." Silence fell. Only the sound of the heart monitor broke it, each beep echoing like a countdown. Lucian looked at Selina, sleeping, fragile, and felt something raw twist inside him. "He thinks I've gone soft," Lucian said finally. Enzo said nothing. Lucian ran a hand down his face, the mask of control cracking just slightly. Tell me what Verno knows. Enough to try something stupid, Enzo replied. He's got eyes on the hospital. I've doubled security, but he's desperate. Word is he wants to send a message. And you threw her. Lucian's hands curled into fists. For the first time in years, he felt the old heat rise, the fury that built empires and buried men. But this time, it wasn't about territory or money. It was about the woman on the bed and the son she'd nearly died bringing into his world. Find Adrian, Lucian said. Bring him to me. Quietly. Enzo nodded and disappeared down the hall. Lucian turned back to the window. Below, men in suits patrolled the hospital parking lot. His empire had always been built on control, on being 10 steps ahead of everyone. But now, for the first time, he couldn't calculate his next move. Every option risked her safety. Every decision carried blood. When Enzo returned, his eyes were grim. He's here. We found him in the lower lot, making a call. He's in your car. Lucian followed without a word. The air outside was crisp, the morning traffic humming in the distance. A black sedan idled by the curb, windows fogged from breath inside. Enzo opened the back door. Adrian sat there, pale and shaking, his cufflinks glinting under the dull light. Boss, listen, I can explain. Lucian slid in beside him, closing the door. The silence between them was worse than any threat. I trusted you, Lucian said quietly. You broke bread at my table. You held my son last year when he stopped himself. What? Adrian swallowed. Verno came to me. He said you were losing your edge. Said you were going to step down, give everything to Calder. You just sold me out, Lucian finished for him. I thought I was protecting us. Lucian looked at him for a long time, the cold fury in his eyes unblinking. You protected no one. A knock on the window interrupted them. Enzo's signal. A van had pulled into the far end of the lot. 2 men stepped out, pretending to smoke, but Lucian recognized the posture, the cut of their coats. Verno's shooters. Down! Enzo barked. The windshield shattered. Bullets tore through the car, glass raining over them. Lucian yanked Adrian down, drew his gun, and fired through the cracked window. 2 shots, clean and precise. Both men dropped. Sirens screamed in the distance. Enzo opened the back door, helping Lucian out, his eyes scanning the rooftops. They knew where you'd be. That was a message. Lucian looked back at Adrian, who was trembling, face streaked with blood and glass. A message you sent. Adrian started to speak, but Lucian's voice cut him off, low, final. You don't betray family and get to apologize. He turned to Enzo. Clean it up. As Enzo pulled the trigger, Lucian didn't flinch. He only looked back at the hospital, where a nurse was just opening a curtain in Selena's room, unaware of the war raging beneath her window. By the time Lucian returned to her bedside, his shirt was speckled with rain and something darker. He sat quietly, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. She stirred faintly, but didn't wake. He whispered, They'll come for us again, but I won't let them touch you. I swear it. For a long moment, he watched the slow rise and fall of her chest, the tiny pulse in her wrist under his fingers. Then he leaned back in the chair, the weight of what he'd done pressing against the fragile peace he'd found. He was a father now, a lover, a killer, and somewhere in that collision, the man he used to be began to vanish. The days blurred together inside St. Victorious. The walls smelled of antiseptic and rain-soaked air. Nurses moved like ghosts in white shoes. Lucian hadn't left the hospital since the shooting in the parking lot. His men rotated shifts outside the door, but he stayed, motionless in the chair beside Selena's bed, a silent shadow waiting for her to wake. Nikolai slept in the nursery down the hall, his heartbeat steady, his tiny hands curled in a fist like he'd been born ready to fight. Lucian went there every morning before dawn, watching the baby breathe through the glass. The first time he saw the boy open his eyes, dark, sharp, unflinching, something inside him shifted. For years, he'd built his empire on fear. Now fear was all he felt. Fear of losing this child before he even got a hold of him. Dr. Morgan entered quietly that afternoon, a thin envelope in her hand. Lucian turned before she spoke. "It's done," she said softly. The results came back. She hesitated, studying the man who could silence a room with a look but now seemed carved out of worry. Then she handed him the envelope. Lucian stared at it for a long time. He'd faced bullets, betrayals, the weight of empires collapsing, but not this. Not the truth waiting inside a piece of paper. He broke the seal with a thumb that didn't feel steady. One glance. That was all it took. The words blurred, but he didn't need to read them twice. Probability of paternity, 99.98%. The world went still. Lucian sat back in the chair, the paper trembling in his hand. His chest felt too small for the thing expanding inside it. It wasn't pride or relief. It was something deeper, the brutal tenderness of knowing he was responsible for a life untouched by the blood on his own hands. He looked toward the nursery window again. His son, his blood, his second chance. Enzo stepped into the room, then voice low. "Everything all right?" Lucian nodded, sliding the paper into his coat pocket. "He's mine." Enzo smiled faintly. Didn't need a test to see that. Lucian didn't answer. His gaze drifted back to Selena. Pale, fragile, but alive. The woman who'd kept his name in secret, who'd carried his child alone while he hid behind the illusion of protection. The woman he'd broken to keep safe. That night, the hospital quieted. Rain returned, light and steady against the windows. Lucian stayed by her side, fingers brushing against her wrist, feeling the faint pulse beneath her skin. "Wake up," he whispered. "You kept my son breathing. You don't get to stop now." She stirred the next morning. A flutter of her fingers, a soft groan. Lucian shot to his feet, leaning over the bed. Her eyelids fluttered, confusion giving way to recognition. "Lucian." His throat closed around her name. "I'm here." She blinked slowly, her voice weak. "The baby, he's safe," he said. "He's strong. You be proud." A small smile tugged at her lips, relief washing over her face. But then her gaze found his, cold clarity settling in. "You left me," she said. Not a question, just a truth dropped like a knife. Lucian froze. You thought you were saving me," she finished, her tone sharp even through exhaustion. "You thought walking away would keep me out of your world. But I was already in it." He tried to speak, but her next words cut through him. "I spent months alone, Lucian. Hiding. Afraid. Carrying a child that would have your enemies hunting me if they knew. You don't get to stand here now and pretend this was protection." He knelt beside her bed, voice low, rough. "I know. I was wrong. Every choice I made was wrong." Her eyes softened, but the hurt remained. "You broke me, Lucian." "I know," he whispered. "And I'll spend the rest of my life fixing what I broke, if you'll let me." She looked away, tears gathering. The monitors beside her beeped softly, filling the silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was fragile but steady. "Why now? Why come back?" He hesitated, glancing toward the nursery down the hall. "Because I got a call," he said quietly. "And when I heard your name, the world stopped. I realized I could live without power, without money, without breath, but not without you. Not without him." She studied him for a long time, searching for the man she once knew. What she saw wasn't the Don who ruled through fear, but the man stripped bare beneath it. Lucian reached for her hand. "I can't undo what I did, but I can make sure neither of you ever have to run again." Her fingers tightened faintly around his, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to breathe. Outside, the rain eased, sunlight catching in the glass like the faint promise of something he'd never believed in, forgiveness. For years, Lucian Dravaro had commanded the city with iron and blood. But in that small hospital room, with the woman who hated and loved him in equal measure and the son who carried his name, he felt the weight of something far heavier. Responsibility. And for the first time in his life, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like purpose. Night fell heavy over St. Victorious. The rain had stopped, leaving the city slick and silent, a calm that felt too deliberate, the kind that came before blood. Inside, Lucian sat beside Selina's bed, his hand resting near hers. She was stronger now, color returning to her face, though exhaustion still clung to her like a shadow. Down the hall, Nikolai slept in the neonatal ward, unaware that the world outside his crib was made of gunmetal and ghosts. Lucian had almost begun to believe they were safe. Enzo entered quietly, eyes scanning the room before he spoke. The guard are doubled. I've got 2 cars idling outside and more on rotation. But something's off, boss. Callum's been too quiet. Lucian nodded slowly, staring at Selina. Quiet isn't his style. He's waiting for me to relax. As if summoned by his words, the hospital lights flickered once, twice, then plunged the corridor into darkness. Enzo's hand went to his gun instantly. Generators should have kicked in. A sharp pop echoed from somewhere down the hall. Then another. Suppressed shots, clean, precise. Lucian's chair scraped back as he stood. They're here. The emergency lights stuttered to life, washing the hall in a dim red glow. Through the glass wall, figures moved, shadows in tactical black, advancing in formation. Enzo pressed his back to the wall, gun drawn. Verno's men. At least 6, maybe more. They've cut power and comms. Lucian's pulse steadied. Not racing, not panicking. This was the world he understood best. Protect her, he said, eyes locked on Selina. Her eyes fluttered open. Lucian, what's happening? He leaned close, his voice a calm she could cling to. Stay down. Don't move until I come back. Before she could protest, he was gone. The hallway erupted in motion, nurses shouting, alarms wailing as the hospital's emergency systems struggled to reboot. Lucian and Enzo moved like ghosts through the red haze. The first gunman turned a corner and met 2 bullets to the chest before he could blink. Lucian took his weapon, sliding low behind a cart. They'll go for the baby, he said. They know that's the weak point. Enzo swore under his breath. Then we move. They advanced through the corridors, floor slick underfoot. The air stank of gunpowder and antiseptic. Lucian's mind was a razor, every step calculated, every heartbeat a countdown. At the far end of the hall, 2 men breached the neonatal ward. Lucian saw one raise his rifle toward the glass. That was all it took. He fired once. The man spun and dropped. The second lunged, knife in hand, but Lucian caught him, slammed him into the wall hard enough to crack tile. The knife clattered to the floor. Lucian's hand closed around the man's throat, and when he spoke, it was a whisper carved from ice. You came for my son. The man's eyes widened, then went glassy as Lucian twisted. He fell limp. Enzo appeared beside him, breathing hard. We've got 3 more down the stairwell, but we're running low on ammo. Lucian reloaded calmly. Then we finished this the old way. The next 10 minutes were chaos, doors bursting open, shouts echoing off stairwell walls. Lucian moved like something out of a nightmare, every strike brutal and efficient. When one of Erno's men tried to flank Enzo, Lucian took him down with a scalpel he'd ripped from a tray. By the time the last body hit the floor, the hall was silent again, except for the beeping of hospital monitors and the distant cry of a baby. Lucian's shirt was streaked with blood, his knuckles raw. Enzo leaned against the wall, panting. That's all of them. Lucian didn't answer. He was already moving back toward Selina's room. When he entered, she was sitting up, trembling but alive. The nurses had taken cover behind a curtain, eyes wide at the sight of him. His face was smeared with someone else's blood, but his gaze softened when it landed on her. It's over, he said quietly. She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, she saw what he'd become. Not the untouchable Don, but a man who'd walked through death itself for the 2 people lying in that hospital. You killed for us, she whispered. I've killed for less, he said. But this time, it meant something. Tears welled in her eyes. Lucian, they won't stop. I know, he said, sitting beside her bed. But neither will I. Down the hall, Enzo was already barking orders, locking down exits and calling for the cleanup crew. Outside, the first police sirens began to wail, too late to matter. Lucian leaned back in the chair beside Selina, the weight of the night pressing against him. Through the glass, he could see the faint silhouette of the nursery, a small shape stirring inside. They want to take everything, he said softly. But they only reminded me what I have. Selina reached out, her fingers brushing his blood-stained hand. And what's that? He looked at her, the woman he'd broken and bled for, and then toward the newborn who carried his name. Everything worth fighting for. Outside, dawn began to rise, washing the city in pale gold. The world would soon know what happened at St. Victoria's, the night the Don of the Dravaro Syndicate broke his own rules, not for power, but for love. And in that light, for the first time in his life, Lucian Dravaro didn't look like a king of crime. He looked like a man who finally had something, someone worth dying for. The storm that had raged through St. Victoria's left more than shattered glass and blood behind. It left a man reborn. 3 days later, the world outside whispered about the hospital incident with fear and fascination. Police called it gang retaliation. Reporters spun it into myth. But inside the walls of the Dravaro Syndicate, truth burned hotter than rumor. Their Don had broken the code. He'd killed for something that wasn't business. He'd risked the empire for love. Lucian stood at the head of the council table in the underground chamber of his estate, surrounded by the men who had once followed him without question. Enzo stood quietly to his right, a pillar of silent loyalty. Across the table, others shifted uneasily, faces hard, eyes suspicious. The long oak table was littered with cigars, half-drained glasses, and the scent of tension. Adrian's chair, empty since the night Lucian executed him, sat untouched. A ghost at the meeting. Callum Verno made his move, said Matteo Ricci, one of the senior capos. He sent a message. What's ours? Lucian didn't answer right away. He poured himself a glass of water, not whiskey, and let the silence stretch until it pressed against every man in the room. Our message, he said at last, his tone quiet but razor-edged, is that it's over. Murmurs rippled through the table. One man laughed under his breath. Another blinked, thinking he misheard. Lucian set the glass down, gaze steady. I'm shutting down the arms routes in Trieste. The offshore laundering through Valencia, gone. We're pulling out of the narcotics corridor completely. What? Matteo slammed a palm against the table. You're dismantling half the syndicate. You can't just. Lucian's voice cut through the protest like a blade. I can, and I will. Enzo didn't move, didn't speak. He'd already heard it coming. But the others weren't ready for the man standing before them now. Gone was the predator who built his throne from fear. In his place stood someone colder, calmer, the kind of calm that terrified men more than fury ever could. You've lost your mind, another capo spat. You think peace keeps you safe? Callum Verno won't stop because you turn soft. He'll smell weakness. Lucian stepped forward, the air thickening with authority. Let him smell whatever he wants. I'm done spilling blood to protect ghosts. For years, we've killed for power. And what has it bought us? Another coffin every week, another enemy every month. He looked around the table, eyes hard. I buried my father in this business. I buried brothers. I almost buried her. His voice cracked, just slightly before he controlled it. And my son would have grown up in the same world. Not anymore. Matteo shook his head. You're saying we just walk away? From everything we built? Lucian's gaze darkened. No, I'm saying we rebuild it. Differently. We'll keep the clean fronts, the construction firms, the shipping contracts, the real estate. But the blood money dies here. A thick silence followed. Some men exchanged looks of disbelief. Others, admiration they didn't dare voice. Finally, Enzo spoke, low, deliberate. He's not asking. He's telling you. The council went still. Lucian walked to the window, overlooking the bay. Morning light cut through the smoke, painting the room in streaks of gold and shadow. "You can follow me," he said, voice distant but sure. "Or you can leave. But if you stay, you follow my rules, not fears." Mateo stood halfway. "And if we refuse?" Lucian turned, the faintest flicker of his old danger in his eyes. "Then walk out now and pray Verno gets to you before I do." No one moved. He took their silence for what it was, surrender, or perhaps faith, or both. Then he exhaled slowly, as if laying down a weapon. Enzo leaned close, murmuring, "You know this won't end here. The other families will test you." "I know," Lucian said. "But for once, I'm not fighting for control. I'm fighting to give my son something worth inheriting." Enzo gave a small, rare smile. "Didn't think I'd live to see the day you turn philosopher." Lucian almost smiled back. "Don't mistake peace for weakness, Enzo. If anyone threatens them again, I'll remind the world who I am." As the men began to file out, uneasy, contemplative, changed, Lucian remained at the window, watching the light shift across the bay. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Callum Verno was surely planning his next move. But for the first time, Lucian didn't feel like a man reacting to war. He felt like one choosing his future. Behind him, Enzo paused at the door. "What do we tell the rest of the city?" Lucian's reflection in the glass looked almost unrecognizable. The same eyes, but a different soul behind them. "Tell them," he said quietly, "the Don just traded his crown for a cause." And as the door closed, Lucian Dravaro stood alone, not as a king among killers, but as a man finally free of his throne. The sea had a way of swallowing noise, of making the world outside feel distant and unimportant. At the edge of Lucian's estate, waves kept time with the slow, steady breaths of the household. Gull cries stitched through the air like a reminder that life went on, indifferent and durable. Selena stood on the terrace wrapped in his old wool coat, the wind picking at her hair. Nikolai slept somewhere inside, his small chest rising and falling against a nurse's careful hand, but the house felt full in a way it had never been before. Toys tucked in corners, tiny socks drying on a radiator, the scent of boiled milk, and something faintly medicinal that meant safety. Lucian watched her from the doorway, the light painting lines across his face he'd never let anyone see. He had traded the city's gleaming crown for a quieter kingdom, a refurbished villa with high walls and fewer enemies, companies that did legitimate work, men who learned to do other things. He still had Enzo at his side, still kept an eye on the streets, still knew how to make the city listen. But those instincts had a new purpose now. They guarded a life, not a ledger. She turned, catching him watching, and for a second he thought he could read the whole of her in her smile. It was small, private, the kind that had once broken him open and then healed him in ways he'd refused to name. He walked to meet her, hands in his pockets, every step measured as if the ground itself might remember his history and judge him for it. "Do you remember the first night we were honest?" he asked, voice low, the salt wind stealing some of the words. She laughed softly. "You mean the night you made me believe you were a monster and then spent the next year proving you weren't? You make it sound noble." He reached into his coat and brought out a small velvet box. He moved without ceremony, because neither of them wanted theater, only truth. He knelt as if instinct still lived in knighthood, as if the boy inside him believed in stories. "Selena Clinton," he said, and the name between them felt like the beginning of something whole. "I built walls to keep the world out. I built prisons to keep myself in. You and Nikolai taught me how to live inside a different kind of room. Will you marry me?" For a moment she didn't speak. The wind filled the silence, the sea untiring. Then she knelt beside him, fingers brushing his cheek. "You left me once," she said, voice shaking in a way that held all the old hurt and the hard-earned forgiveness. "You told me you were protecting me. You were wrong about everything then." "I know," he swallowed. "I was a coward who thought fear was love. I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking you to choose me anyway. Her eyes shone, and when she nodded it felt like the tide turning. He slid the ring onto her finger, not the extravagant symbol he might once have given, but a simple band, bright and new. She laughed, a sound like rain easing, and he stood, pulling her close until the two of them were a shape that bristled with history and hope. The wedding was simple because small things were finally enough. Enzo stood by as witness. Older men from the staff and a couple of friends they'd kept from the old life filled the room. No limousines, no brass bands, just a quiet afternoon, a table of bread and wine, a promise said aloud in a room that smelled of lemon and the sea. Selena wore a dress that suggested joy rather than announcement. Lucian's suit was the same cut it had always been, but his shoulders carried something softer. When they exchanged vows, Lucian said words that were not made for headlines. I won't pretend to be clean. I won't pretend every wrong can be undone. But I will spend what's left of my life proving that some things are worth more than fear. Selena's reply was a whisper that made the room breathe. Then spend it with us. They named the baby Nikolai at the small gathering, a name that sounded like a promise and a warning in the same breath. Lucian placed his hand on the child's small head and felt the future tremble beneath his palm. He vowed, not to any counsel or code, but to the small life that slept in his arms. You will have a better legacy than I had. You will inherit work, not war. You will inherit kindness, not fear. Word of the marriage and the naming would ripple outward, provoke whispers and tests. Callum Verno would grumble, and the old families would watch, waiting to see if the dawn had truly changed. Lucian expected it. He had not mistaken peace for weakness. He had not forgotten how to strike. But the monster who had once ruled by instinct lay buried beneath decisions and dawns. If it ever clawed its way up, he promised himself it would be a monster resurrected only to protect what he could not bear to lose. That night, stars low and pale over the dark water, Lucian carried Nikolai out to the rocks. The baby fussed, then settled against his chest. He looked at Selena, at the woman who had carried his blood and his shame and his redemption, and spoke low so only she could hear, "If they ever come for you again." She turned, eyes steady in the starlight. "They'll meet the monster I buried." He meant it in a way that had nothing to do with threats and everything to do with a man who had learned what he loved could not be bargained away. The ocean kept its quiet. The house behind them held warmth and children's shadows. In the end, the empire that had once been his life became the backdrop to a smaller, truer kingdom, one he would guard with the ferocity of a man who finally understood what mattered. The man who once ruled through fear now lives for love. Lucian Dravaro's story closes not with blood or vengeance, but with a promise. A man who built an empire out of darkness, choosing to raise a family in light. The camera pans to the horizon, Selena laughing faintly in the background, Nikolai's small hand reaching toward the sky, and Lucian's voice drifts through, steady and low. If they ever come for you again, they'll meet the monster I buried. In a world where loyalty is bought with blood, Lucian Dravaro chose something rarer, redemption. If you believe love can tame even the darkest soul, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that blend crime, passion, and fate. Hit subscribe, turn on the bell, and join us for the next chapter of Mafia Soul, where every love story has a body count and every heart has a secret. These stories are born in the shadows and told with the heart. See you in the next video.